Welcome to The Explainer. When you think about the great military rivalries of the 21st century, one matchup stands above all others: the United States and China. But the big question is, who's actually head? It's really not as simple as just counting ships or dollars. So today, we're going to break down the numbers, the tech, and the one crucial factor that could decide everything: geography.
Okay, so let's start where everyone usually does, by following the money. At first glance, the U.S. defense budget, at over $830 billion, just seems to completely dwarf China's estimated $471 billion. But, and this is a huge but, in military strategy, headline numbers can be incredibly deceiving. The real story is almost always hidden in the details.
So to really get our heads around this, we're going to break it down into 5 key areas. First, we'll dig deeper into the price of power. Then, we'll dive into the clash on the seas and in the skies. After that, we're looking up to the absolutely critical high ground of space. And finally, we'll pull all those pieces together to see what this new balance of power truly means.
All right, first up, the price of power. So why was that first budget chart we looked at kind of misleading? Well, it all comes down to what's actually being counted, and maybe more importantly, what's not. You see, China's official defense budget, the one they announced to the world, is just $232 billion. But that number is, well, it's pretty deceptive. It conveniently leaves out huge costs like their paramilitary forces, the Coast Guard, and a ton of research and development. Once analysts factor all of that back in, the estimated spending nearly doubles to $471 billion.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. What happens when we apply that exact same logic to the United States? To get a true apples-to-apples comparison, you have to add in things like the U.S. budgets for Veterans Affairs and Homeland Security. And when you do that, the American total balloons to around $1.3 trillion. So yes, the spending gap is still massive.
Okay, so with that kind of financial firepower in mind, let's head out to the high seas. Because this is where we see the first, really clear example of two totally different strategies clashing head-on. It's a classic contest of quantity versus quality.
So on paper, China's Navy is the biggest in the world. I mean, look at that. A staggering 841 ships compared to America's 465. But that number hides a critical detail. The U.S. holds a massive trump card: 11 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers. These are basically floating cities with air bases. China right now only has 3. And that difference in size and capability is everything. On average, American ships are just way bigger and project a lot more power. This gives the U.S. Navy more than double the total fleet weight or tonnage of China's. It just goes to show it's not about how many ships you have, it's about what those ships can actually do.
But here's the thing, China is smart. They know they can't win a carrier-for-carrier race, so they're not even trying to play that game. Instead, they're building what are called asymmetric weapons, cheaper systems designed to take out a much more expensive one. The best example? Their growing arsenal of hypersonic missiles. These things are so fast and maneuverable that some reports suggest they could pose a very real threat to those exact same carriers that form the heart of American naval power.
All right, let's leave the ocean and look up to the skies. Because what we find up there is a very similar story playing out. A classic matchup of technological advantage versus sheer industrial scale, all in the race for air superiority.
I mean, just look at these numbers. The United States has a massive lead, both in the quantity and the quality of its air power. We're talking over 13,000 military aircraft in total. That's nearly 4 times what China has. Now, the gap in fighter jets is a bit smaller, but it's still decisively in America's favor.
But the real contest, the place where the future is being decided, is with the most advanced aircraft, 5th-generation stealth fighters. You know, the planes that are practically invisible to radar. For years, the U.S. was the only game in town with its F-22 and F-35. But now, China's J-20 Mighty Dragon has entered the ring, and they are building them at a truly stunning pace. And this right here is where China's biggest strength really kicks in: its incredible industrial power. Some estimates suggest China is cranking out around 120 of its J-20 stealth fighters a year. That sheer speed is how China plans to close the technology gap in the air.
Okay, our next battlefield is arguably the most critical one for any modern military, because it enables pretty much everything else. We are talking about space.
You know, for decades, space was basically America's domain. That era, it's over.
According to analysis from the RAND Corporation, China has now reached parity in counter-space capabilities. What that means is they've developed the ability to disrupt, disable, or even destroy U.S. satellites, just as the U.S. could do to theirs.
And how'd they do it? By building completely independent systems from the ground up. They no longer rely on America's GPS. They built their own global network, called BeiDou. They've also launched fleets of sophisticated spy satellites and, yes, developed anti-satellite weapons. All of this ensures that in any future conflict, space would be a heavily contested battlefield.
So, we've looked at the money, the ships, the planes, and the satellites. But what does it all really mean? When you put all the pieces together, what's the actual strategic picture look like?
This timeline from the RAND Corporation might be the single most important visual we look at today. It focuses on just one specific but very plausible scenario, a conflict over Taiwan. And just look at what's happened. In just 2 decades, the balance of power for attacking ships at sea has completely flipped from a major U.S. advantage to a Chinese one.
And that gets to the heart of why this all matters so much. For the last 20 years, China's military modernization hasn't really been about challenging the U.S. everywhere on the globe. No, it's been laser-focused on geography, on creating what experts call a home court advantage, where its forces are most powerful right on its own doorstep.
And that brings us to the core of this entire rivalry. The U.S. military is designed for global reach, to project power anywhere on Earth. China, on the other hand, has taken a completely different approach. It has concentrated all its growing power to dominate its immediate neighborhood, with the very specific goal of making it too difficult and too costly for the U.S. to intervene in a place like the Taiwan Strait.
This leaves us with a final and pretty provocative thought. As technology like hypersonic missiles and the strategic importance of geography completely reshape the modern battlefield, our old ways of measuring power, just counting ships and planes, might not apply anymore. The most important question might not be who has the bigger arsenal, but rather who has the smarter strategy for where and how a conflict might actually be fought.